Okay, but without further ado, we're going to turn to our main event. It's tip-off time, right? And so Professor Annie Boustead is a longtime friend, longtime collaborator. I'm not going to do justice to your impressive background, Annie, so we're going to keep it pretty short and sweet. But she researches legal and policy issues related to electronic surveillance, privacy, policing, and drug policy. She's particularly interested in empirically studying law enforcement surveillance, evaluating the impact of policies regulating this surveillance. She has a PhD from the Pardee Rand Graduate School, where her dissertation focused on the interplay between commercial data collection and law enforcement surveillance, and a JD from Fordham University School of Law. We've met at Kennedy back in the day, and Annie's fantastic. We're very lucky to have her here, guys. And it's poignant, it's 9/11, but I think actually, in some ways, this is useful and a good bridge, because your work focusing on, in this case, privacy, national security, the fact that they're not a false choice, as you rightly point out in that paper, I think is a really good fodder for us to think about and reflect on today. So thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you for coming. I've never had a basketball lead-in video before.
That's not great. I do that every week. So.
I'm really excited to present my current work in progress, which focuses on figuring out how we can facilitate better encryption policymaking through science. And so this is sort of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, but really my main goal is to convince you of three things. The first is that we absolutely don't know anywhere near enough about encryption to make any sort of a logical policy decisions about it. The third is that we are capable of knowing more, but the key barriers are in the way that we haven't really come across a way to overcome. And third, if we did know more, we could move towards evidence-based encryption policymaking, which would be tremendously beneficial towards helping us in a couple of different things. And so first off, just to kind of start off with the basics, encryption is a set of tools that you and I use every day. It helps to encode information that's either stored on a device or transmitted from one user to another, such that the only person who can access those communications are the person who has access to the device, or the person sending or receiving that information. That includes the manufacturer of the device not being able to access encrypted communications, or in many cases, the service provider not being able to access the contents of communications. Encryption has been around for literally millennia. So I start over here. This is a Caesar shift cipher, which was commonly used by Julius Caesar. This is not in Hamilton, but a lot of the founding fathers used to complain that their mail got read quite a bit. And they developed and played with encryption as a way to prevent that. As communication technology improved, so did encryption that was used to protect those communications. So during the 1990s, Netscape kind of developed SSL, which is the program that was used, or the kind of protocol that was used to transmit credit card information. And as you can imagine, in the 1990s, as the internet is being commercialized, being able to do that securely is a really, really kind of critical thing. Encryption continued to be made easier to use. And one of the big turning points was in 2015, when Google and Apple moved towards encrypting devices by default. So encryption was no longer a thing that you as a consumer needed to turn on and implement. It became something your device just did. And now most of us use it and we don't think about it. Encryption is critical. It's really important for cybersecurity, both on the individual and the personal level. It's also really critical for facilitating free speech and free organization by allowing people to communicate amongst each other, especially minoritized or persecuted people who might be concerned about their communications being read. It helps facilitate public trust and helps encourage economic growth and competitiveness. But at the same time, widespread use of encryption, particularly after the implementation of encryption by default in 2015, poses real and significant difficulties for law enforcement. Criminal investigations and national security investigations have long relied heavily on law enforcement being able to access the contents of communications pursuant to a warrant in order to kind of gather information. And the fact that they are no longer able to do so commonly because of encryption, or that they're able to do so much less often, has been referred to as the going dark problem. And it's a real concern for law enforcement on the national and the local level. And specifically, going dark refers to the fact that sources of information usually available have been shut off. This has been an issue for terrorism cases. It's been an issue for child sexual abuse material, or CSAM cases, as well as drug crimes and kind of all other types of investigation you might think of. I'm sorry, I think I went too far. Yeah, there we go. At the same time, however, we know astonishingly, like really terrifyingly little about this. What few data are available are only available for limited places, for limited contexts, and for limited jurisdictions. So one area where we do know something kind of is the wiretap reports. These are problematic for a number of reasons that I can tell you about at great length if you want me to. But basically this is detailed information that's provided about every law enforcement request for the contents of communication on both the federal and the local level. And it includes, since I want to say like 2012, they started asking, have you encountered encryption? And this is just showing the percentage of instances where law enforcement encountered encryption where they were unable to access the contents of the communication. You'll notice this jumps around 2014, 2015 when you see that implementation of encryption by default. However, wiretaps are relatively rare events. This is not what law enforcement is commonly using to conduct surveillance. There were 50,000 of them between 1969 and 2012. So that's 50 years in all jurisdictions nationwide. That's not a lot. 50,000 sounds like a lot, but when you consider the scope of what this is, it's not actually all that common of an event. The New York District Attorney's Office or the Manhattan DA's office has published a couple of different reports, just kind of describing what they see as the problem. And so this is an example of their reporting of the rates of locked devices that they receive. One thing to note, the entire country is not New York. And so information about New York doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about what's going on in other places. And the information that's in these reports are kind of, you take what you can get. So they don't really report consistently over time. Sometimes you're like, well, I really want to know this, and I can't figure out what this is from what you've given me, which is a little bit frustrating. In reality, though, it's not just the device. So it's not just like how many devices are we getting, but it's also the whole decision-making process around the device that we don't know anything about. So this is a logic model that I developed showing kind of potential decision-making pathways that law enforcement might have to engage in once they obtain a device. So here they get a device, and then it's locked, it's unlocked, or it's locked, and then what could happen next? We don't know anything about any of this. And a lot of this decision-making process is really important as we try to parse through potential policy implications. And this is like, the fact that we don't know anything is really concerning because this is a conversation that's been happening for literally decades. And contentious is an understatement. It's commonly referred to as the crypto wars, which I cannot believe no one has used as a movie title yet. But in the 1990s, I know, right? Who did Oppenheimer? They can do this. In the 1990s, when Netscape started developing kind of stronger encryption products for consumers, there was a lot of kind of pushback, and the federal government developed something called ClipperChip, which was built in such a way that the government could access the contents of whatever was encrypted using that chip, because they basically had a key. They had like a backdoor key. There was a huge amount of pushback from this. This actually sparked the first crypto wars. So we're actually now on the second set of crypto wars. And eventually they kind of gave it up. But these kind of notion that we should have policies where our encryption allows law enforcement to kind of keep a key safe has continued to be made through this day. And it's also continued to be criticized. So there's a 2015 report called Keys Under Doormats, where a group of computer security experts argued that these policies would open doors through which criminals and malicious nation states can attack the very individuals that law enforcement seeks to defend. There have also been arguments, although I don't really think we've seen pending legislation, that law enforcement should essentially engage in hacking. And so this notion of like lawful hacking, and if we're not given access to these devices, we should break into them ourselves. There's a lot of pushback to this, as you might imagine, and the lawful hacking debate is a fascinating kind of other topic. Although several prominent incidents where law enforcement has been able to get access to encrypted devices. So I'm thinking specifically about the San Bernardino shooting. They got that access after hiring commercial firms to basically do the hacking for them. Then when we start talking about kind of specific legislative efforts, we have the Earn It Act, which first happened in 2000, and then again in 2022, and again in 2023. It was introduced all of those times, which required telecommunication companies to adopt best practices. Best practices were identified through a panel of experts that mostly involved law enforcement. And if they didn't adopt these best practices, they didn't get liability protection under Section 230, which is a big deal if you're a communications company. Just in case you're thinking, you didn't say anything about encryption there, why is this an encryption problem? Like in the press in the press conference, like right after they proposed the thing, they said, and by the way, by best practices, we mean encryption. Like they should be implementing encryption in such a way that law enforcement can get in the back door, or responsible encryption, whatever that means. And so there was a lot of pushback, and a lot of kind of the conversation around this involved encryption. And so the 2022 and the 2023 version of this have included some explicit protections for encryption. The last policy I want to mention is the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act, which was introduced in 2020 and would have just required law enforcement companies to provide assistance. You have to be able to do it. We won't tell you how. And this is very similar to what we saw with CALEA, which is the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, which requires telecommunication companies to design their networks in such a way that law enforcement can implement wiretaps. And that was decided in the mid 1990s. A lot of pushback. It didn't end up going very far. But all of this policymaking effort, all of these kind of conversations have kind of revolved around empirical arguments. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting there's not normative components to this. Like there's absolutely normative components to this. But a lot of this debate involves what are fundamentally empirical claims, even if the people making them don't like address or identify them as empirical claims. So when Lindsey Graham, who introduced all of those bills that I mentioned on the last page, says things like, you know, there are numerous terrorism cases and serious criminal activity where vital information cannot be accessed. That is an empirical claim that he's making. And ideally, we should be addressing that empirical claim by answering research questions such as what percentage of devices encountered by law enforcement have been encrypted. And we have no idea what the answer to that is. When James Comey says things like encryption by default is making the challenge to law enforcement and national security officials markedly worse, he's really making an empirical claim about how encryption by default has changed kind of law enforcement access to communications. We could answer that question. We haven't answered that question. And so when privacy scholars make arguments like, you know, that were made in these two reports, this is Don't Panic. It's a group of scholars out of the Berkman Center. And then this is by Peter Swire and Kanisa Ahmed. It was in their article, Encryption and Globalization. They're fundamentally arguing that it's okay that stuff is going dark and it's okay we're losing information to encryption because we have all these new sources of information. So we have metadata, we have IoT devices. But that's fundamentally an empirical claim about how law enforcement officers make decisions regarding encrypted communications. And we don't really have a lot of evidence about that. So I realize there's no amount of evidence that's actually going to change Lindsey Graham's mind about this. And that's fine, because that's not really the goal. And I don't think that's like an appropriate research goal. Research such as this can help the rest of us who have to evaluate these claims and make decisions and decide who to believe and what to believe. And so one of my goals is to figure out what needs to be done in order to answer questions like this. I'm actually going to skim this. I went into like a fair amount of detail with regards to the research design because I wanted this to be a resource to people who might be trying to do this research without a lot of research background. But a lot of it kind of comes down to like appropriate access to conduct interviews, good sampling techniques if you're trying to answer questions like how much, and repeated measures over time and place in order to do some of the causal designs that people are suggesting. And so given that we have this research, we need all this research, why haven't we done it yet? And so then I go on to identify some barriers that kind of really come into play when we start talking about encryption research. And so the first one is that we need participation from multiple groups that may not have the most uncomplicated relationships with each other. And so to see what I mean by this, if we go back to kind of this logic model that's looking at kind of the law enforcement decision-making process, when I talk to law enforcement, I'm like, hey, I could really use this data. Wouldn't it be great if we had this data? They tell me to go talk to tech companies. And I think that makes total sense. Like, I think that would be a very efficient way to go about getting this data. I think there's a lot of like potential benefits to that. But the tech companies are only going to be able to tell me this much. And this much is not going to give us an accurate picture of what like the encryption problem actually looks like. We also need the participation of law enforcement to get all of this kind of decision making. And we probably want kind of district attorneys or someone on the prosecuting end to tell us like something about outcomes. And so we run into what I like to call the stone soup problem. If anyone remembers the children's book, there's a village that's starving because they can't make any soup. And a little kid says, I'm going to make soup out of this rock. And everyone calls him crazy. And he ends up going to all of his neighbors and getting like a little bit of vegetables from one and a little bit of meat from another. And by the time he's gone to all these neighbors, he has like, you know, enough stuff to make soup, and he makes soup. here, each of these people have pieces of information, but there's no like incentives or organizing principle for them to contribute. And so the village continues to starve. And then like the second kind of barrier is that law enforcement encounters with encrypted devices are difficult to observe. Law enforcement surveillance in general is difficult to observe on purpose. This is not an accident. They don't really want this to be seen unless they do, but it's meant to disincentivize bad behavior. But it's hard to get data. They're like notoriously protective around this information because they don't want people realizing how they conduct surveillance, where they might be conducting surveillance. Oftentimes it can be hard to observe and collect it yourself because people don't realize that they're being surveilled. So you can't like go around and look to see where the surveillance is occurring if you want to just collect those data personally. This is a snippet from a 2017 letter by Senator Ron Wyden, who's done a lot of work on tech transparency, basically saying, you know, there's so much we don't know. This is kind of like such a black box. You really need to provide more information. Some states have better sources of information. So I'm thinking specifically of Minnesota, which does publish some reports, but it's few and far between, and we really don't get a good sense of the whole picture. The third kind of key barrier is that there's no like well-established definition for measuring any of these things. And so when we do get information, we can't really combine it in any sort of a meaningful way. So here, this is how the US Administrative Office of the US Courts describes their encryption information, which they talk about instances where encryption was encountered. When you look at something like the New York County District Attorney, they're talking about locked and unlocked phones. And so I'm not really clear like the extent to which you can really make comparisons across these. The New York District Attorney's Office does give you some more information about whether or not they're actually able to get into those phones. They don't do it consistently year after year. So trying to construct any sort of a bigger picture is impossible. And so we kind of, even where we get information, it's not information we can use. And so then I suggest 4 ways of kind of moving this forward in order to get some better policy relevant information. And the first is to kind of incentivize and to facilitate integrated research design. So far I've talked about like all of these different types of research questions and how they can contribute to our understanding of evidence-based policy. But in addition to that, another important thing to note is that they can also help us inform the design of other research questions, especially in an area like this where we know nothing. And so, you know, doing descriptive studies can help us identify potential causal mechanisms that we can explore using causal studies. Descriptive research can also help us guide the design of a survey, which we can distribute using a probability sample in order to get a parameter estimate. And so thinking about how to fit all of these pieces together as we're starting an encryption research agenda is really critical. And that's something that potential funders should probably think of moving forward. One of the big issues in this area is the lack of data. So, you know, researchers are incentivized by data availability. If you release it, they will come. And so I identified 3 potential pathways for making data easier to find. The first is to make it easier to find existing data sets, which are very piecemeal. So build some sort of an annotated bibliography so that people can go and look for it. Another one is to adopt or add in encryption questions into existing surveys of law enforcement. So like the law enforcement, management and statistics survey. There's a survey that goes out like every so often to law enforcement that has the same battery of questions every year, but sometimes they'll include little supplements on things like body worn cameras. We should have one of those for encryption. The third is that the funding organizations and the people who are kind of trying to move this forward, they don't just need to fund the research, they also need to act as the person who makes the own soup. So they need to start, you know, like going out and getting like input and data from multiple sources at once, not just one particular source. And that should be something that kind of gets prioritized. In terms of developing consistent measures, we need something like the transparency toolkit for law enforcement agencies. This was developed in 2016 and then re-released in 2008. And it's basically a guide for tech companies who want to release information about their requests for information that they receive from law enforcement. And it kind of establishes how do you do this in a rigorous way and how do we do it in a repeatable way across tech companies. We should develop something like this for law enforcement agencies who may want to release some information. So when we do get those little drips and drabs of information, we can compare them across places and over time. And then here are some just kind of things I think something like this should probably include. And then finally, it's important to acknowledge that the greatest barrier to using social science to better understand the encryption debate are political, they're not statistical. So the actors who are best able to provide this information do not have incentives to do so, and oftentimes have incentives not to do so. So law enforcement doesn't necessarily want you knowing about their surveillance because it could impede the effectiveness of it. Tech companies may not want you to know how often they give information to law enforcement because they don't necessarily want their customers realizing that. In addition, a lot of these agencies, especially law enforcement, are acting in constrained mission-oriented environments with a lot of demands in their time, especially demands for research. And so the more we can do to kind of facilitate and to centralize data collection to improve efficiency and reduce respondent fatigue will help that out. Things like increasing research outreach and translation so that people realize how the information they are provided is actually being used and what's useful in it for them. And then the last thing is to think about what we measure. So what we measure tells us what we think counts. And here I'm thinking specifically about the color of surveillance literature, which talks about how different communities are differentially impacted by surveillance, especially law enforcement surveillance. So make sure we are collecting information that can identify and potentially come up with ways to address like kind of the interests of those who are disproportionately impacted by surveillance. Okay. That is the end of it. My ultimate goal in all of this is evidence-based encryption policy, which is not a thing that anyone's really kind of tried to move towards before. But it was something I think I clicked my slides and I did not click you guys. Which is something that we, nobody's really tried to come up with before, but I think we need. So what would be involved in developing an evidence base for that? I came up with a starter question, but I would really love to hear what you guys all think. And I look forward to your feedback immensely. And then this is how you can reach me in case you need to reach me. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna.
What a tour de force. And it's great because this is the home of one of the mini homes of mixed methods, but this is terrific. Our main goal, so I should have said, Annie's in the same department as like Adela Schlager and like Liz Baldwin. So a lot of core workshoppers at Arizona. So part of this is to have Annie drink the Kool-Aid and keep coming back because you can tell she's really doing some impactful, amazing work. I'm going to keep the queue. Per usual, students get the first dab, if any students want to, no pressure, okay? But then from there, and Jamie, you still count? Sure, yeah. So maybe Jamie, then I'll keep the queue and go around, but do you have a question or something to clarify? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Do you want to turn that off?
Oh, yes, oh, sure, yeah, let's make that a little bit easier to see. Yeah. But Jamie, do that while we're doing this and I'll start keeping the queue, okay?
Oh, sure. As I was listening to your talk, the question kept coming back to me, what virtue is presumed, on behalf of like law enforcement and government? Are we presuming that these are good actors, that they're bad actors, that predict the motives? What are you seeing in the conversations on encryption?
Well, so this is, I think, part of what's like frustrating about watching this is that there's a large range of the amount of virtue that's assumed. And so the people who are advocating on this more from the law enforcement side are pointing out like, their interests and sometimes like when I've talked to law enforcement officers, it'll be like, why do people need to know this? Why, like, just stay out of our way. A lot of the pushback is it's a range of, sorry, I want to make sure I don't lose my notes. It's a range of concerns, everything from, very practical concerns, like you're going to ruin the internet if you do this, to like really kind of philosophical and kind of broader concerns about the, the relationship between the individual and the state and how law enforcement functions. So I think just based on literature, you see everything, especially because it's a deep problem that kind of cuts across a lot of things.
Okay. Okay, it is open, guys. All right, anybody. So yeah, Gustavo, and then like I said, I'll keep an eye out for others.
So I'm not sure that it could help for the development of an empirical approach to this. Is what if you try to focus on things in which the companies in charge of encryption, they have an incentive that these crimes are prosecuted, like IP violation. So when, for example, when they are reporting those crimes, I think they have more incentive to violate their own rules for self-interest. And now suddenly you have a case in which the incentives of the law enforcement and those in charge of encryption are aligned versus the more typical case in which they are not aligned. And maybe you can say something in those instances.
I really like that. I think that's a really great idea for getting people to kind of work together. Thank you.
I just have a two finger on that.
Jess, please,
which
Jesse.
is, I don't know if you're familiar with this literature, but there are now more models of sort of trying to understand strategic information revelation. So there's sort of in the auditing, finance and auditing area, there's sort of like, how do you, what is the role of the auditor in actually trying to get data revealed that maybe is not otherwise wished to be revealed? And then I have an article that's looking at like totally different area on like violent conflicts, right? Here's the thing where there's not really an incentive for, particularly in my case, governments to reveal information about the number of civilians that they kill, and yet they do sometimes. And if we can, and so the question is can you draw on some of those literatures, given what you've said about like, these are not things that people are super excited to share for all sorts of reasons. There may be some sort of on the shelf models, not that you necessarily need to use, but could help sort of highlight when these incentives might be at work and when there might be some interesting, not necessarily obvious or observable incentives that might help you understand the kinds of bias you're likely to see in the data that you do get, right? Because that's always going to be the problem with this.
I think that's really interesting, and I'm gonna look into that literature more because I think that could actually be really helpful, especially because, like, as you were saying, it's really fascinating to me because like a lot of law enforcement officers like don't want to do data, like that's it's not a thing. But like I've had, you know, wonderful conversations with key informants who really see this as like, you know, I want data about this out there because I want people to understand how hard this is for us to do. And like that kind of dichotomy and how that could potentially bias results, I think could be really interesting. So I'll look into that some more.
To follow up, there's actually somebody right now working on this question in crime and police statistics.
Wonderful.
Like the incentives to report those things and to divulge that information and what kinds of incentives might be at cross purposes there.
Perfect. Perfect.
You know about that.
Awesome, Jess. Thank you, yeah. Did you have one as well? Okay, yeah, so Jesse, then Simon, and like I said, I'll keep an eye out.
So two questions. The first one is more in the category of adding to the unanswerable questions probably, but the question I didn't hear you mentioning was what percentage of say terrorist acts were communicated by encrypted means such that we could have been aware otherwise? And is the assumption that it's basically 100%, you know, that like because most communication is almost all communication is encrypted, and because people are talking about these things digitally, that's the prior.
So that is a very hard question to answer, which I don't think is really surprising. What I will say there is that you run into a lot of issues with the fact that it, like, there's a difference between, like, I think there's law enforcement would not draw a distinction between make it possible and make it harder, or make it harder to do it in a timely way, because it's a very kind of time pressured environment where they're trying to get information really quickly and as inexpensively as possible. So if I were answering this as a law enforcement officer, I would say, well, even if we could, you know, still get it, it would take longer. And as it takes longer, it increases the risks of something going really bad, or we may not be able to intervene in time.
I guess I'm thinking of things like I might be sitting around the dinner table planning my terrorist with my friends and not doing it over Signal or not doing it over. And so that could be a different angle into kind of looking at the spread of how these things are in general without actually having to address directly for the most the encryption question. Anyway, but I agree, it's just on the hard list. Yeah, the second question was possibly looking at broader empirical questions. So something like, not that these are the only costs, but like what are the economic costs of surveillance? And you mentioned some at the very beginning, versus the economic costs of terrorism.
Yeah, I think there have been some papers on the extent to which the Stone revelations like impacted different like companies that might have been involved with it. That might be an interesting thing to pull in. So thank you.
Can I two-finger that? Yeah. Are you actually, are you trying to capture terrorism?
So
Probably.
yeah, so my intuition here would be, so I would just like to know how often this happens, like as a just like a basic, just kind of general thing. If I had to pick a crime type to come in on this, it would probably be narcotics,
Right.
just because I think narcotics investigations are kind of a whole kettle of fish, and terrorism is going to be the thorniest one to kind of thread. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, Simon and Edu.
So thank you for the presentation. I'm currently a doctoral student in law in the area of cyber law and policy. And I think one of the frustration that I meet is, most of the time our research is based on speculation or philosophy instead of evidence. So I really enjoyed, this presentation. And I think I want to focus on maybe expanding a little bit on the question about empirical, encryption project. And, so I can see most of the, again, philosophy for the area is more on national security. But then is including like privacy or free speech and part of your research agenda? And two examples would be like, so when it comes to privacy, what is reasonable expectation of privacy under the Fourth Amendment? Are those part of kind of the research agenda? And then how do these interact with each other? And when it comes to free speech, I think that's like the main barrier. So whenever there's a new policy out there, and as you said, the break the internet hypothesis, anything about the internet is going to break it. But then how do you encounter that and importance to your research on national security? When it comes to the Apple case, one of the arguments that the lawyer made was that algorithm is a form of speech under the First Amendment. So how do these broader questions interact with your empirical claim or empirical agenda?
So I think that's a really fascinating question with regard to the Fourth Amendment thing in particular. I think Chris Tal, has some interesting work that's related, but not quite on this, looking at basically how people, what kind of reasonable expectations of privacy or expectations of privacy that society holds attaches to different kinds of surveillance is really interesting. With regard to the specific thing you mentioned, so I have actually tried this. I have a paper out that's used a survey experiment to ask members of the general public as prospective jurors whether or not they weigh the kind of data we lose to encryption the same as they would weigh metadata or other sources of information as a way of seeing whether or not these empirical trade-offs hold for other members of the criminal justice system. And I think those are important to do. And I think there's it's a great way to get leverage. And I think we actually should do those studies and as many of them as we can. But I also think that there's an extent to which we kind of also need a law enforcement focus on this because they're the ones who are actually making the underlying decisions. And I think if we don't probe that decision-making process, we run the risk of, because you do your survey, you do your study, and then you have policy implications. And we're going to end up in a situation where we have policy implications that involve changing everyone's behavior, except for the actual people who are engaging in kind of the initial underlying conduct. And I think exploring that and making that a little more visible to the public is a really important part of kind of blowing this whole thing open in a way that allows for transparency. And so I think that's kind of part of it. I also think that yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. But thank you. I think that's a great question.
Edu, please.
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about the international context for this, both in terms of legislation, what is the range of things that you can find, but also in terms of the research agenda that you present, because it compares what other people are doing elsewhere, complement.
So my work is largely US domestic because I have a real interest in Fourth Amendment law, which means Fourth Amendment. But I will say this is an area where other countries have tried some interesting policymaking and run into similar issues. So members of the Five Eyes, so the kind of the surveillance communities that the US tends to participate in, a lot of those member states have had issues around various types of encryption policy. I think Australia has gone the farthest in terms of passing policies that actually go about shifting how encryption is implemented in order to facilitate law enforcement surveillance. You do get a tiny bit more data on some of those that could potentially be useful, but it's not necessarily enough to run a quasi experiment that you might actually want to run. I think there was something, I had just seen a paper out of I want to say Norway, that had looked at some of these issues. But I think so the short answer is a little bit, but not really in a satisfying way. And then also, I think there's a lot of extent to which this is going to vary across context, and US law enforcement is really a specific context. It's much less standardized than you see in a lot of other countries. And so I'd be curious about the extent to which information we derive from those contexts might also be able to apply to ours. But that is an interesting thing to look into, and I will follow up on that.
Yeah, we did a paper after the San Bernardino, I think,
Mhm.
shooting where we did some comparisons.
Yeah.
I think Australia is a particularly pertinent one because it's like a backdoor to the backdoor because they have a mandatory backdoor. And then we have an intelligence sharing relationship
Yeah.
with them, so we can get data then from.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm so sorry. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Afternoon, right? Yes. My name is Bernice Stoughton. I'm with the O'Neill School at the Indianapolis campus. And I do some work with law enforcement, but more police youth engagement programs. And I was wondering if you can speak to some of the challenges that you face working with law enforcement agencies, because I know one of the challenges is, having to build that rapport and relationship. And if you do wanna, if you do want them to be more involved and being able to provide information or be more open to engage,
Yeah.
like what were some of the challenges you faced working and how you overcome those challenges?
Well, so I haven't actually been able to do like a lot of work with law enforcement on this specifically because I've sent out hundreds of emails and gotten nowhere. So I've done like that whole thing. I've done work with law enforcement. Like I've gotten a couple of like kind of key contacts with people who are really interested in this. And like, there's been some like probing around the edges, but like actual data and actual interviews, no one's wanted to do it. I've done it previously with regards, so my dissertation included interviews with law enforcement officers to ask them how they think about, deciding to request information from commercial entities. And that was, a real challenge. And so the logic model I developed was kind of partially based on that. That was a real challenge. And it was a lot of, being told no. And at that time I was at like a think tank that, like had a relatively good reputation. And so like it was perhaps like a more neutral way to come about it. And I had like, I had talked to some of them previously, but I think relationships and patience is really all you can do. Like I wrote 40 pages because I was so frustrated that I couldn't do the research. So like it's a little bit of that. And I think, to be honest, it's like just kind of gonna continue to be a little bit of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because my dissertation also, I did interviews with police officers, program leaders, and kids impacted by gun violence. But I was just curious to know if your experience was different. I mean, of course, it took years to build my relationship with the agency, and I lost contact with another agency due to COVID. But yeah, it makes sense that.
Well, so then do you have any advice? Like, did you have any experience?
I mean, I did. I think in terms of building a relationship with the agency, showing up, sharing your story, why is it that you're interested and how can they benefit? Not so much of how I really need this data to do this research, but really how this is going to help you.
Yeah.
And how this information is not like, I'm not here to hurt you, because of course they're trying to protect their reputation. They don't want to say anything. And even through my interviews, a lot of the officers would mention things like, this is above my pay grade. I don't want to talk about this, which is where interviewing the program leaders made a difference.
Yeah.
And like I said, from my first year of my doctoral dissertation, started building this relationship in 2018, late 2018. Didn't really get any interviews until late 2021. Yeah. So again, that relationship, being patient, having continuing to show up if you're really interested in getting them involved and showing them the importance. And of course, once you do the research, sharing that information, what you find, either presenting. For me, it meant presenting at their quarterly board meeting, showing them how this research is really going to help them in their youth program and so forth. So that was some of my approaches. Yeah. It took a long time. That's why not much people do it, but.
Yeah. Those are great approaches. And I think anything you can do to kind of translate, the research and best practices are really critical. Just to be clear, part of the reason I find this a really interesting question is because I don't know an answer to it. So like I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I honestly couldn't tell you like whether we're better off with the status quo or with like any policy that would implement this in a different way, or we should adopt something like Australia's approach after years of thinking about this. So it's a really hard thing to do. But good luck on the dissertation.
No, it's done.
It's the best dissertation.
Just do research now.
No, I think Angie, go ahead, and then I think, did you have one? Or,
I don't want to take a student spot. So I'd rather-
oh, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
I'd rather have a student.
Yeah, no, please, go ahead, please, and then, yeah.
I was just wondering, like, when you were delineating the type of, or like the scope of the research that you can answer, if there is, like something you can learn by looking at failures of encryption. And that like got me thinking of like what is if there are like what is the process of encryption and like the bottlenecks that might be encountered in your logical model, like because it is both about getting information and be able to decode it. So I was like when like you were talking about like for instance law enforcement agencies talking with tech companies, whether that means that they get the information but they just don't know what to do with that, and that limits the ability that they can interact with it, or it's both that when they get in touch with these tech companies they just get like processed reports and they're ready to to use. So I was just trying to think about like.
Well, so I think that's a really interesting idea. And I think the few cases where we do know like more of an almost case study approach about what has been going on is situations where we have seen some failure, because the failure is what incentivizes people to speak up and say, hey, we don't have access to this data. So like the San Bernardino case, I think would be a really important like example of that. So even though they eventually got the information, it was a failure in the sense they didn't get it in like a timely way that they could use it like kind of initially. I think that also raises like the possibility of doing like encryption postmortems. So cases where like kind of like, not or like I don't know what it's called when the doctors do that, where they all kind of sit together and they talk about a case that went really wrong. It has a name. I don't know what the name is.
Morbidity case.
Morbidity reports. So something like that could be really interesting as a way of and like they may be more willing to talk about those cases, and then that could go towards your point about like providing law enforcement with stuff they could use, because that would help identify potential weaknesses that would be actionable.
Because I was just thinking like maybe there should be, or I don't know if there's a literature on like hacking events, on like what led to some specific systems to be hacked, and like whether it was like related to the problem in how encryption was.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting idea. That could be like an interesting way to frame it.
Excellent. Please, yeah.
I'm Beatriz, student here. Thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot, and also I really like how you organized it. One thing that I was thinking, maybe it's a very like one-on-one question for me at least. How does encryption like shows up as a word to describe surveillance in this process? Because when I think of like wiretaps, for example, I think of surveillance, like how encryption as a technical word.
Yeah. So you can think of encryption as falling into, there's like a broader category of behaviors that you could consider like surveillance self-defense. And I want to be clear, like that is not the only reason people use encryption. And a lot of time people are using encryption for reasons that have nothing to do with law enforcement and just have to do with the fact that they didn't change the settings on their phone, or they are concerned about like their boyfriend opening their phone, or like a lot of the kind of more immediate concerns really have nothing to do with law enforcement. It just has this kind of secondary effect. But you can think of encryption as something that's kind of acting as a barrier to law enforcement being able to conduct surveillance in the way they always have. And so like people are making like this whole kind of cloud of decisions, and some of them are overlapped, regardless of kind of like why they're making it. Some of it is having the effect of interacting with law enforcement. So I don't think it like, a phone is encrypted whether or not you're a drug dealer who's trying to avoid your information being accessed by the police, or you're just a person who, likes their privacy or doesn't want anyone reading their group chats, which is the valid thing. But both of those kind of interact with the surveillance in the same way. Yeah, thank you.
And we are having some Zoom issues, guys. So there's 2 rooms going right now, which is why you saw a cat appear in the other one. That's not like a surveillance cat. It's like helping us out.
I approve of people showing pictures of their pets, like
I mean,
all of these things. It's what I've missed the most about the pandemic has been everyone's pets.
Oh, no, so I totally agree.
Confirm that I'm not a cat.
Surveillance. I'm a cat.
So I think we have Angie and Subi and Jesse.
I'll go
And
after
Isak.
other people who haven't.
Okay, so maybe, Subi, would you like to? Subi, and then Angie, then Isak? Yeah.
So Vimal from India.
Nice to meet you.
So 2 questions. First is, you mentioned a little bit that you are not following much on the international aspect, but I just wanted to tell you that WhatsApp has a court case in India. This basically came up in 2021 when India notified some very radical intermediary guidelines regulations, which got implemented from May 2021. And the case is there in one of the courts. Basically, it was about the source code, and the government in many cases wants WhatsApp to give the source code, and they have come up with the argument that my whole story goes aghast if I need to do. And WhatsApp has 535 million users in India. It's very popular also. So the question is, now I also interact with a lot in the law enforcement, and we have almost 30 states. So law enforcement in India is a state subject, hence each of these police forces encounter different levels of issues when it comes to dealing with encrypted communication that goes around in the networks. So the constant complaint that they have is that it's very difficult to get information from the platforms, even when it's involving some terrorist incidents. My first question to you is: do you see, there is a little bit of culture also that comes to when it, seeking of encrypted communication and all, and the level of acceptability, resilience, and everything? Do you think that's also coming in? Because somewhere we'll have to globally discuss this. It's becoming on and on an issue, and of course, it's a very complicated case because I know the judges are also themselves consulting many of people like us also who work in the system about what is a possible way to do it. That's the first question. The second question is, as quantum computing comes up in a big way, where do you see the interplay with encryption?
Okay, so to
Easy
the
ones.
first question, I would actually really love like a name for that case or like a specific way to access it, because I would love to be able to look into that further. I think with regards to like the thing you're talking about, which is like, so I've written previously on like the practical difficulties that law enforcement faces when getting commercial surveillance. And the extent to which like that decision-making process is non-trivial. And it looks different from the considerations that law enforcement has to face when they're doing like physical surveillance, but it's not self-executing. Like it's all of that. I think Alan Rostenstein has a really great article on encryption, surveillance intermediaries that deals with that in like a surveillance context. And Jan Van, it's not out yet, is a graduate student at Berkeley. She's also done some work on that from more of like the tech company side rather than the law enforcement side. And that's some really interesting work as well. Whenever she publishes, she graduates and publishes and all of that, because I think it's a really fascinating topic. And so you do end up with, so like companies can be varying degrees of helpful depending on how much they want to help. And so in some cases, like if you say user ID, like username instead of user ID, they will come back at you with, well, we don't have username. Regardless of the fact they have a field called user ID, and that might be what you meant. And so there's a lot of like kind of pickiness that they can do with regards to like giving you the information. And some of that I think does come into play with encryption, but then with encryption, like they also just genuinely don't have the information, which I think changes a lot of that. And so a lot of it comes into the decision about whether or not they should be doing things where they can't access the contents of communication to begin with, which, raises a whole bunch of like really thorny issues. I have given very little thought to the quantum encryption thing, mostly because it just makes everything so much harder. Like, it's like, we're either gonna like have to figure out a way to like, I mean, harder, but like also like wonderful and fascinating. Like it's going to be like a huge complication that like once we start getting that technology in place, like what that actually looks like is just going to be like, I don't know enough about the potentials yet. And to be honest, the potentials may still be uncertain enough that like my kind of research might not be useful. But like, I think one thing to think about is like, what could be developed from this for best practices for that implementation, especially that I think like the status quo is really hard to shift in this place. So as we're figuring out what a new status quo looks like, we're going to be stuck with it for a while. But I think it's a really great question. I can't answer satisfactorily, so thank you.
So we can answer it.
No, I can answer it.
That's it. And quantum's one thing, but you still have now courts that are like, there was a Snead case in Illinois that says, hey, defendant, you have to enter in your passcode to unlock your phone, right? Or in other contexts, even law enforcement can use your face or your fingerprint. I mean, talk about decision-making and other aspects beyond just, quantum. And that is, to Edu's point, I mean, that really does vary, obviously, a great deal around the world, but.
And that goes into the whole like the encryption workarounds and all of those. But the extent, like all of the work I've seen on encryption workarounds is fascinating, but it's also theoretical. And we have no idea if these ever work or if a company, if law enforcement in New York is able to use them because they know to try to do it, but like law enforcement in a small city can't use them or a small town can't use them. And that's a whole other thing.
No, that's it. So I think Angie, Isak, Jesse, we'll do a bit of a lightning round here.
Because my question is so simple.
Isak, please.
So I think building off of what you just said, when at your decision matrix here, which I think is really fascinating, this sort of, let's call it an action arena for the sake of being here. Where you're looking at law enforcement and the decisions that they're making in that setting. I'm really interested in how that looks differently with different jurisdictions. And then there's a bit here that I would add, which is, are they ever seeking help from others, right? So, you know, what this looks like in New York versus Bloomington, Indiana, versus the FBI versus the DEA versus, you know, somebody who could ask the NSA to help, right? So, and then how that interfaces with the different types of, you know, child pornography crimes are very different than narcotic crimes versus, you know, and what access and capacities people have, I think is really interesting.
So the first question with regards to how this looks different. So this is like a logic model that's meant to explore possibilities. I would really love to be able to do research where I like figured out how thick those lines should be for different types of jurisdictions. So like, because I think that would be just such an interesting thing. Like, and it would be so useful to law enforcement because there may be, part of what frustrates me about this is that it's very likely that there are less challenging options than generating backdoors, but we don't really think about like how we could potentially implement those options or how they might look differently across jurisdictions. And we don't know who's using them because we haven't done the research to explore the space, so we don't really know what the options are. But I would absolutely love to do that research because I think it's going to be so different and it's going to be really interesting. With regards to the looking at other jurisdictions, this was actually one of the things this was the big project I worked on in grad school. So it was helping. It was with the smartphone apps ecosystem and helping law enforcement figure out how to identify potential places to go to get information. So it's not just the app developer or the device manufacturer. You can also go to like the advertisers who might have information and all of that. It was an incredibly fascinating project and like asking law enforcement, how do you go? But even just formalizing those processes, because a lot of those processes are, I call the guy who knows everything about this and, you know, he helps me figure out like what I should do next. Or there's this listserv and I go there and I ask a question, but then a lot of that's going to depend on whether or not the guy's answering his phone that day or who's looking at the listserv. I think like things we can do to formalize those processes, and we have like a whole spiel on it, could be really useful. And that's a situation where we're making things more efficient without drilling in and developing new capabilities, which is like, you know, a potential way to get like reduced harm, increased value, which I would really love to see us doing more of. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, and Lisa. Yeah, please.
I'm thinking.
We have 3 or 4 minutes for 3 or 4 amazing people. So.
We have really short answers.
It's terrific. We have lunch after this, so we're good. Yeah. Lisa,
I
please.
don't even
Waiting all this time.
No, it's okay. I will see her later again.
We need to have dinner together tonight, but still.
Thinking in terms of collaboratively managing common pool resources, has there been any effort to bring the top honchos, male or female or whatever, into a room to do like a negotiated rulemaking process on this? Because it's happening everywhere all the time. And there's no consensus on a set of rules.
So I would really love to see something like an encryption war game, which I think would be very similar to what you're talking about, only it's more of like an applied thing and less policy making, just to kind of think through like and identify the potential like hard spots where like people run into issues without like the actual stickiness and concerns that arise in an actual investigation. So, you know, let's all speak in hypotheticals that we know are closely related to reality. I have not, the amount of convening that would be required for that is not something I think I necessarily have the leverage to do. I think that like, it's a really hard situation to kind of get things in, like to get that kind of situation going. And it's not, they do not necessarily have easy relationships, but I think that would be such a great way forward and I would really love to see it.
Okay. And you, Jesse.
You know, Angie. Mine are more like kind of left field ideas, so I feel like.
Okay.
Let's wrap it up, then I feel bad. It's not a 2-minute question.
Okay. Well, you want to throw out one left field idea? And you can use it partly by way of wrap up and concluding remarks.
Well, just riffing on that, there's some think tanks, see of course that do have like that's their bread and butter is convening power, and I wonder if forging some relationships with them. Expert. Yeah, I was just thinking about like from a totally different perspective, which it wouldn't address your actual research questions. What about kind of algorithms that would involve sharing your data with a group who is not the state? So like sort of polycentric peer transparency groups that have some sort of like keyword alert system, or you know, like I just obviously insert good algorithm design here, but there's kind of totally different approaches in a very like Vincent-esque kind of like, don't just assume it's either the state or nothing.
Well, so Apple has actually tried to step into that space. So they developed specific, or they tried to develop like specific algorithms, for lack of a better word, that would scan like scan people's photos and then compare the hashes to known hashes of child pornography that they got from I forget the acronym, NCMEC. So like the National Association for like Exploited and Missing Children. It got a lot of pushback specifically because there's no way to verify whether or not the hashes that they're seeing are actually child pornography as opposed to like, you know, pictures of drugs.
I would call that bad algorithm design.
Well, so but there's no, I think it's both the algorithm, but also the like there's not a lot of transparency and there's not a lot of trust.
Yeah.
And I think it also has real implications for like you know, children who like, you know, may like, especially because like sometimes it was we'll tell law enforcement and sometimes it was we'll tell their parents if like the kids are getting pictures of naked people. There were real concerns about like, you know, gay children who may not have accepting parents who may face concerns like regarding that. So there was a lot of pushback to that. None of that got off the ground, but it's I think an interesting example for you.
Yeah, I mean, I would think of maybe like a sentinel that then gets forwarded to the same agency that might evaluate direct surveillance flags. So anyway, totally different approach that doesn't address the data collection issue. No.
But it's I think it's a space people have tried to do work in and it's been hard. Yeah, but I like the idea.
I wish we had more time. This has been absolutely fascinating, but any final comments?
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your comments and everything. And it's been so nice to join you on your first week of the year.
Thank you so much for coming. You're all very busy people. We do have lunch right after this. We do have a WAF meeting, an affiliated faculty meeting on Wednesday, just to get that on your radar. And next Monday, we have Eric Alston joining us. So come one, come all. Thanks again, Carrie. And we'll have some food.
That was terrific. That whole introduction.
Oh, you